Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Gavin Lon Digital. I'm Gavin Lon. In the previous tutorial, i.e. part 18 of this course, we completed the functionality for the registration modal dialog. So this means that members of the public now have a facility to sign up as members of the TechTree web application. So once a user has signed up to be a member, what does that mean in terms of that user's experience with the application when that user subsequently logs on to the application as a member? In a future tutorial, we'll implement code where a logged on member will have access to the courses that have been matched to the relevant member, i.e. the relevant user will be able to consume the content associated with the courses matched to the user. In this tutorial, we are going to build the functionality whereby an administrator will be able to match multiple users with a particular category. In the context of our application, a category denotes a particular course. For example, C# for beginners, advanced C#, etc. At this point in the course, we have completed the CRUD-related functionality for 4 of our custom entities: category, category item, content, and media type. Still outstanding is the necessary functionality required for an administrator to input data for the user category entity through our web application. So the category entity has a many-to-many relationship with the ASP.NET Users Identity Table. We are using the User Category table to join our custom tables with the identity tables. The User Category table can be described as a join table and facilitates the many-to-many relationship between the category table and Identity's ASP.NET Users table. So when a user registered with the system using the registration dialog, an appropriate entry was made into the ASP.NET Users table. When a member of the system, i.e. a registered user, logs onto the system, we only want to present the relevant user with the courses to which the relevant user has been matched. In this tutorial, we are going to provide administrator staff at TechTree, our fictional organization, with a user interface whereby an administrator can match users to courses. At the database level, this simply means appropriate entries are made into the User Category database table. So in a later tutorial, we'll create code so that when a user logs onto the system, only the courses that have been matched to the relevant user are presented to the user. In a later tutorial, we'll also provide a facility where the user can pick the courses that are of interest to the user. So the user will also have the ability to match the user with relevant courses. At the database level, when a course is matched with a user, this simply entails the relevant category ID and user ID being inserted into the User Category database table. So you can see how the User Category table joins the ASP.NET Users table containing registered users with the category table containing the courses saved to the system. For content like this and much more, please consider subscribing. And please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description. It will be greatly appreciated. A special thank you to those kind people who have bought me coffee. Thank you very much, it is greatly appreciated. So, I've split this tutorial up into 4 sections. Section 1. Create the user model view model and the users category list model view model. We'll discuss what is meant by a view model in terms of MVC later in the tutorial. These view model classes will be used to store the data that will be passed between the client and server. Section 2. Create the _users list view partial view and its parent index view. We'll create a partial view that will display a checkbox list view to the administrator. Each item in the checkbox list view will represent a registered user, i.e. a member of the system. The main view, i.e. the parent index view, that will render the _users list view partial view, will contain a select drop-down list populated with the categories saved to the system. Remember, in the context of our application, a category is a course. So this facility allows an administrator to match multiple users with a particular category through this user interface. To assign multiple users to a particular category, the administrator selects the relevant category from a drop-down list and checks the checkboxes representing members of the application in the checkbox list view. Once the administrator is satisfied with the administrator's input, the administrator clicks a Save button, and code on the server side handles the relevant data inputted by the administrator and updates the user category database table accordingly. Section 3. Create the UsersToCategory controller. In this section, we'll create the server-side functionality that saves the administrator's data inputted on the client to the database. Section 4. Create the UserStoCategory.js file. This file will contain the jQuery and AJAX code so that client-side code can interact with the server-side code asynchronously. Section 1. Create the user model view model and the UsersCategoryListModel view model. So we have already created the user category model that resides in the default area in a previous tutorial. The underlying user category table was derived from this model through the execution of an EF core migration. So the class representing the user category entity can be described as a typical MVC model class. In this section of the tutorial, we are going to create what's known as view models. So before we implement the code for our view model classes, let's briefly discuss what is meant in MVC by a view model. So far in this course, we have been dealing with models where most of the properties map directly to fields in an underlying database table. So for example, the properties in the category item, content, and media type models almost map perfectly to their corresponding underlying counterpart database tables. You may come across cases where you need to create models where the properties are not directly mapped to underlying database table fields, or where you only want to include a subset of the properties pertaining to a specific entity's fields, i.e. the requirement does not necessitate including all of the properties for each of the fields in a particular entity. There may be cases where you need to combine the properties from multiple entities into one model, because the requirement for a particular UI necessitates a custom model. So we can achieve more sophisticated view customizations by appropriately implementing view models. We can then appropriately strongly type the relevant view with the relevant view model. So let's create a view model in the models folder within the admin area. Let's create a class named UserModel. I'm going to use the model suffix in this application as a convention indicating a view model. So in this model, we only want to include a subset of the fields available in the ASP.NET Users Identity Database table. In terms of our requirement here, we only need to include a few of the fields available in the ASP.NET Users table. So we can create a view model based on the ASP.NET Users entity that contains only the properties relevant to this particular requirement. So let's create the following public properties for our user model view. ID, username, first name, and last name. Let's create a new view model in the admin area within the models folder and name this view model UsersCategoryListModel. For this model, let's create the following public properties. An integer public property named category ID. A public property named users that is of type iCollection and is strongly typed with our user model view model, i.e. the view model we created just before creating this view model. a public property named UserSelected that is of type iCollection and is strongly typed with our UserModel.cs. So the property named users will contain a collection of all the registered users saved to the system and will be implemented on the UI as a checkbox list view. The property named UsersSelected will contain a collection of users that have been saved to the system for a particular category. The category ID property denotes the relevant category. So the UsersSelected collection will contain data pertaining to what is currently saved to the user category database table, i.e. a collection of users saved against a specific category. The category is denoted by the category ID. So in terms of the UI, you'll see how this model denotes a selected category from a drop-down list containing all the categories saved to the system, a checkbox list view containing all users saved to the system, and the items that are checked, meaning those users being matched to the selected category in the relevant drop-down list. Let's create a new partial view within the admin area in the shared directory. Let's strongly type our partial view with the UsersCategoryListModel view model. Please note that if you don't wish to follow me as I write out the code, you are of course welcome to copy the code from the relevant GitHub repository and paste it into your project. A link to the relevant page on GitHub has been included below in the description. So let's create the heading for the checked list view. So let's implement code to check if the user's collection is not null. And when the user's collection is not null, we want code to execute to loop through the user's collection. So within the loop, let's output a checkbox. Followed by the user's first name and the user's last name. Okay, we are now going to create the parent view, i.e. the view that will render our user list view partial view. Let's create a directory within the views folder in the admin area named UsersToCategory. Let's create a new view within our UsersToCategory directory named index.cs HTML. So in the interests of time, I'm going to paste the code for our parent UsersToCategory index view into the view file that we have just created. If you are unclear what is going on with the code when viewing this part of the tutorial, please see the completed code on GitHub. An appropriate link has been included in the description. Let's look at the code we have just pasted into our code editor. So this view is strongly typed with an IEnumerable collection of category types. Also included at the top of the code is a using directive to the TechTree MVC web application.extensions namespace. You'll see in a bit that we are using the convert-to-select-list extension method, which is a member of the TechTree MVC web application.extensions namespace. Below this, we have a select drop-down list that will contain a list of categories saved to the system. The ASP-items helper tag has been used here to populate the relevant drop-down list. Note that we are using the convert-to-select-list extension method that we created in a previous tutorial to convert a collection of category objects to a collection of select list item objects. By projecting the collection of objects of type category into a collection of objects of type select list item, we are able to populate our select drop-down list using the ASP-items helper tag, like we are doing here. But there is a problem here at the moment, and that is because in order for our link code to translate the category objects to select list item objects, the category class must implement the iPrimaryProperties interface. So let's ensure that the category class implements the iPrimaryProperties interface. Great. The code includes a HR element here to separate the drop-down list from the checkbox list view that will be rendered when the _users list view partial view is rendered. You can see here that we have code that renders the _users list view partial view. We have a button at the bottom of our code here that will be used by the administrator to submit the administrator's input to the server. Great. So let's go back to the _users list view partial view and implement the code that decides, as it were, whether an item in the checkbox list view should be checked or not be checked. Let's create the code that checks a checkbox or leaves the relevant checkbox unchecked. So in order to assess whether a checkbox should be checked or not, we can perform a comparison on the current user with the users stored in the users selected collection. So we can use links contains extension method for this purpose. So I want to implement a custom comparer class that we'll pass to the contains method. This class will contain code that will tell links contains method, as it were, how to compare one user model object to another. Let's create a folder named comparers within the default area. Let's create a class named compareUsers within the comparers folder. So let's make the compareUsers class implement the iEqualityComparer interface that is strongly typed with the UserModel.view model. So we need to implement code for two methods. Let's implement code for the first method named equals. We can implement our custom comparer to compare our user model objects on their ID properties, like this. Then we can implement code for the getHashCode method by returning an appropriate unique hash code. If you'd like to read more about hash codes, I've included a link under the additional information section in the description. So let's go back to the _user list view partial view and include a using directive at the top of our code that references the namespace containing our new CompareUsers class. If the user-selected collection object is not null and contains the current user within our loop, then we want the checkbox to be checked. Note, we are passing in the CompareUsers object to the contains method to, as it were, let link know how we want our user model objects compared, i.e., what criteria is used to assess equality between the two relevant objects. For the else condition, we must simply write code to output a checkbox that is unchecked. So the only difference between a checkbox element that is checked and a checkbox element that is unchecked is that the checked checkbox element contains a checked attribute, and an unchecked checkbox does not contain a checked attribute. Section 3. Create the UserStoCategoryController class. Let's create a class named UserStoCategoryController. So remember, we created a folder named UsersToCategory that contains the index view that will contain the client-side functionality for our UserCategory entity. We named our new controller class UserStoCategoryController. This effectively creates the appropriate association between the index view that resides within the UsersToCategory directory and the controller class named UsersToCategoryController. The association between the relevant index view and the relevant controller is automatically established due to a naming convention established within the MVC framework. So in our MVC application, the UsersToCategoryController is associated with the index view within the UsersToCategory folder. Note that the UsersToCategoryController class inherits from the controller class. The controller class is a member of the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC namespace. Let's create a constructor that accepts the database context object as an argument. This object will be passed in via the dependency injection system. Let's assign the context object to a read-only member variable within the constructor. Let's create an action method named index. The implementation for this method simply returns all categories currently saved to the system to the client. So this action method pertains to a HTTP GET request. Let's create an action method that pertains to a HTTP POST request. Let's name this method SaveSelectedUsers. So firstly, let's create code to project the administrator's selected users and selected category ID into a collection that stores objects derived from our user category entity. So let's create a private method named getUsersForCategory.to-add. This function will return a collection of user category objects that we will be able to add to the user category database table through EF core. Let's create a link query to project the category ID and user list selected input into a collection of user category objects and return the collection to the calling code. Let's go to the calling code and assign the returned result from the getUsersForCategory.to-add method to the relevant local variable. Let's create a private method named getUsersForCategory.to-delete. Let's write a link query to project the category ID selected on the front end by the administrator and user list currently saved against the relevant category ID into a collection of user category objects and return the collection to the calling code. So the getUsersForCategory.to-delete private method returns a collection of user category objects that we wish to delete from the user category database table. Let's go to the calling code and assign the returned result from the getUsersForCategory.to-delete method to the relevant local variable. So now we want to delete the records returned by the getUsersForCategory.to-delete method from our database, and we want to add the records returned by the getUsersForCategory.to-add method to our database, and we want these two operations to run within a transaction. So this basically means that if one of these operations fail, all of the operations fail. So we only want data committed to the database if both operations succeed. So we can implement this all-or-nothing database transaction in code like this. So let's create a private method that returns all users saved to the system. Great. Then we must write code to return the partial view back to the client with the relevant data, which includes all users currently saved to the system, as well as users currently saved against the relevant category ID. The relevant category ID is also included within the view model object passed back to the client. Lastly, let's create an action method pertaining to a HTTP GET request that returns all users saved to the system and all users saved against a specific category ID. The relevant category ID is passed into this method as an argument. So all the users will appear in the client browser as the list items in a checkbox list view. The checked items in the checkbox list view will be the items that are currently saved against the category ID passed into this action method. Let's create a private method that returns the users that are saved against a particular category ID in the user category database table. The relevant category ID is the category ID passed into this method as an argument. So this HTTP GET action method returns all users saved to the system and all users saved against the relevant category ID to the calling code. The users collection contains all users that are denoted by a list of checkboxes on the front end. The users selected collection will be denoted on the front end by those checkboxes that are checked, i.e., these are the users saved against the relevant category ID in the user category database table. Great! Section 4. Create the UserStoCategory.js file. Let's add a JavaScript file named UserStoCategory.js to the JS directory. Let's create the appropriate jQuery code. We want to write two methods that use Ajax to communicate with the UsersToCategory controller. The first method is triggered when the drop-down list that contains a list of all categories saved to the system is changed, i.e., when a different category is selected by the administrator. So when this change event is triggered, we want code to execute that sends a GET request to the getUsersForCategory action method. We can then populate the user checkbox list view with the data sent back from the server. So let's create a function to handle the onChange event for the category select drop-down list. So when the relevant onChange event is fired, the partial view containing the user checkbox list view data is added to the appropriate element in the document object model. Let's add the code to handle the button click event that will be triggered when the administrator saves the administrator's relevant inputted data to the system. So let's set up the code to handle the relevant click event. Let's write code to collate the data that we wish to pass to the server. Let's assign a callback function to the success property to add the partial view returned from the server to the relevant DOM element. So we assign the relevant function to the success property of the object we have passed into jQuery's AJAX method. Note that we are using the reusable Bootstrap alert functionality that we created in the previous tutorial in our code here. And of course, when using the ID attribute as a selector, we must not forget to precede the relevant ID with the hash symbol. So before we run the code, we need to link the appropriate menu item in the main menu to our UsersToCategory index view. So let's open the _admin menu partial view and make the appropriate modification. We also need to appropriately reference two JavaScript files in the UsersToCategory index view. Specifically, we need to reference the JavaScript file that contains our reusable code for the Bootstrap alert functionality and the JavaScript file we have just created, i.e. the JavaScript file we have named UserStoCategory.js. Great! And now for the fun part, bug fixing. But what could possibly go wrong? Let's find out. Right, and we have a horrible error presented to us. The message here does not reflect the root cause of the issue. Let's go to our code. We can fix this issue by initializing the model attribute within the _userList view partial view, like this. Let's run the code again. Great, so we can now see our user interface, which doesn't look great, but at least we are currently not getting any errors. So when we select a category, what happens? Okay, so we would expect to be presented with a checkbox list view, each item denoting a user saved to the system, but we are getting nothing. Let's launch our developer tools by pressing F12, and you can see that there is a syntax issue within our JavaScript code. Oh, I didn't include open and closing brackets for our callback JavaScript function here. So let's fix this. Great, so we are now presented with our list of users, but the UI looks horrible. So we can make our UI look more presentable by adding appropriate Bootstrap classes to our table element here. And that looks much better. So let's try to save the data to the system. Okay, so let's look at our JavaScript code. So the issue here is I didn't include the data property for the object passed to the Ajax method here. So let's fix this. Okay, so now we are no longer getting the exception, but our data is not being saved to the system. Let's look at the code on the server side responsible for saving our data to the system. Oh, and I can see that I've made a fundamental EF call related error here. Once code to modify the database has been executed, we need to call the save changes async method. So we need to call this method after the relevant deletion operation and then after the relevant addition operation. Okay, so we seem to have an issue when unchecking all user items for a particular category and subsequently attempting to save our input to the system. So this issue is occurring because of a null reference exception. So let's create code whereby the collection to be added to the system is only populated if the user's selected collection is not null. Great, that has fixed the issue. So, the administrator now has a facility whereby the administrator can match courses to users. Excellent! For content like this and much more, please consider subscribing and please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and please share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description. It will be greatly appreciated. I really enjoy reading your comments, so please feel free to engage with me in the comments section. The latest code can be found on GitHub. I've included a link to the relevant repository below in the description. Thank you and take care.